This week's Grimm Fairy Tales: The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs. There was once a poor woman who gave birth to a little son, and as he came into the world with a call on, it was predicted that in his 14th year he would have the king's daughter for his wife. It happened that soon afterwards the king came into the village, and no one knew that he was the king, and when he asked the people what news there was, they answered, "A child has just been born with a call on. Whatever anyone so born undertakes turns out well. It is prophesied, too, that in his 14th year he will have the king's daughter for his wife." The king, who had a bad heart and was angry about the prophecy, went to the parents and, seeming quite friendly, said, "You poor people, let me have your child and I will take care of it." At first, they refused, but when the stranger offered them a large amount of gold for it, and they thought, "It is a luck child, and everything must turn out well for it," they at last consented and gave him the child. The king put it in a box and rode away with it until he came to a deep piece of water. Then he threw the box into it and thought, "I have freed my daughter from her unlooked-for suitor." The box, however, did not sink, but floated like a boat, and not a drop of water made its way into it, and it floated to within 2 miles of the king's chief city, where there was a mill, and it came to a standstill at the mill dam. A miller's boy, who by good luck was standing there, noticed it and pulled it out with a hook, thinking that he had found a great treasure. But when he opened it, there lay a pretty boy inside, quite fresh and lively. He took him to the miller and his wife, and as they had no children, they were glad and said, "God has given him to us." They took great care of the foundling, and he grew up in all goodness. It happened that once in a storm, the king went into the mill, and he asked the milkfolk if the tall youth was their son. "No," answered they. "He's a foundling. 14 years ago he floated down to the mill dam in a box, and the mill boy pulled him out of the water." Then the king knew that it was none other than the luck child which he had thrown into the water, and he said, "My good people, could not the youth take a letter to the queen? I will give him 2 gold pieces as a reward." "Just as the king commands," answered they, and they told the boy to hold himself in readiness. Then the king wrote a letter to the queen, wherein he said, "As soon as the boy arrives with this letter, let him be killed and buried, and all must be done before I come home." The boy set out with this letter, but he lost his way, and in the evening came to a large forest. In the darkness he saw a small light. He went towards it and reached a cottage. When he went in, an old woman was sitting by the fire, quite alone. She started when she saw the boy and said,
"Whence do you come, and whither are you going?"
"I come from the mill," he answered, "and wish to go to the queen, to whom I am taking a letter, but I have lost my way in the forest. I should like to stay here overnight."
"You poor boy," said the woman, "you have come into a den of thieves, and when they come home, they will kill you."
"Let them come," said the boy. "I am not afraid, but I am so tired that I cannot go any farther." And he stretched himself upon a bench and fell asleep. Soon afterwards the robbers came and angrily asked what strange boy was lying there.
"Ah,"
said the old woman,
"it is an innocent child who has lost himself in the forest, and out of pity I have let him come in. He has to take a letter to the queen."
The robbers opened the letter and read it, and in it was written that the boy, as soon as he arrived, should be put to death. Then the hard-hearted robbers felt pity and their leader tore up the letter and wrote another, saying that as soon as the boy came, he should be married at once to the king's daughter. Then they let him lie quietly on the bench until the next morning, and when he awoke, they gave him the letter and showed him the right way. And the queen, when she had received the letter and read it, did as was written in it, and had a splendid wedding feast prepared, and the king's daughter was married to the luck child. And as the youth was handsome and agreeable, she lived with him in joy and contentment. After some time the king returned to his palace and saw that the prophecy was fulfilled, and the luck child married to his daughter.
"How has this come to pass?"
said he.
"I gave quite another order in my letter."
So the queen gave him the letter and said that he might see for himself what was written in it. The king read the letter and saw quite well that it had been exchanged for the other. He asked the youth what had become of the letter entrusted to him, and why he had brought another instead of it.
"I know nothing about it,"
answered he. "It must have been changed in the night when I slept in the forest." The king said in a passion,
"You shall not have anything quite so much your own way. Whosoever marries my daughter must fetch me from hell 3 golden hairs from the head of the devil. Bring me what I want, and you shall keep my daughter."
In this way, the king hoped to be rid of him forever. But the luck child answered,
"I will fetch the golden hairs. I am not afraid of the devil."
Thereupon he took leave of them and began his journey. The road led him to a large town, where the watchman by the gates asked him what his trade was and what he knew.
"I know everything,"
answered the luck child.
"Then you can do us a favor," said the watchman, "if you will tell us why our market fountain, which once flowed with wine, has become dry and no longer gives even water."
"That you shall know," answered he. "Only wait until I come back." Then he went farther and came to another town, and there also the gatekeeper asked him what was his trade and what he knew.
"I know everything,"
answered he.
"Then you can do us a favor and tell us why a tree in our town which once bore golden apples now does not even put forth leaves."
"You shall know that," answered he. "Only wait until I come back." Then he went on and came to a wide river over which he must go. The ferryman asked him what his trade was and what he knew.
"I know everything,"
answered he.
"Then you can do me a favor," said the ferryman, "and tell me why I must always be rowing backwards and forwards and am never set free."
"You shall know that," answered he. "Only wait until I come back." When he had crossed the water, he found the entrance to hell. It was black and sooty within, and the devil was not at home, but his grandmother was sitting in a large armchair.
"What do you want?"
said she to him, but she did not look so very wicked. "I should like to have 3 golden hairs from the devil's head," answered he, "else I cannot keep my wife."
"That is a good deal to ask for,"
she said.
"If the devil comes home and finds you, it will cost you your life. But as I pity you, I will see if I cannot help you."
She changed him into an ant and said,
"Creep into the folds of my dress. You will be safe there."
"Yes," answered he. So far, so good. But there are 3 things besides that I want you to know. Why a fountain which once flowed with wine has become dry, and no longer gives even water. Why a tree which once bore golden apples does not even put forth leaves. And why a ferryman must always be going backwards and forwards, and is never set free."
"Those are difficult questions,"
answered she.
But only be silent and quiet, and pay attention to what the devil says when I pull out the 3 golden hairs."
As the evening came on, the devil returned home. No sooner had he entered than he noticed that the air was not pure.
"I smell a man's flesh," said he. "All is not right here."
Then he pried into every corner and searched, but could not find anything. His grandmother scolded him.
"It has just been swept," said she, "and everything put in order, and now you are upsetting it again. You have always got man's flesh in your nose. Sit down and eat your supper."
When he had eaten and drunk, he was tired, and laid his head in his grandmother's lap, and before long he was fast asleep, snoring and breathing heavily. Then the old woman took hold of a golden hair, pulled it out, and laid it down near her. cried the devil.
"What are you doing?"
"I have had a bad dream,"
answered the grandmother.
"So I seized hold of your hair."
"What did you dream then?"
said the devil.
"I dreamed that a fountain in a marketplace from which wine once flowed was dried up, and not even water would flow out of it. What is the cause of it?"
Oh, if they did but know it," answered the devil. "There is a toad sitting under a stone in the well. If they killed it, the wine would flow again."
He went to sleep again and snored until the windows shook. Then she pulled the second hair out.
"What are you doing?"
cried the devil, angrily.
"Do not take it ill," said she. "I did it in a dream."
"What have you dreamt this time?"
answered he.
"I dreamt that in a certain kingdom there stood an apple tree which had once borne golden apples, but now would not even bear leaves. What think you was the reason?"
"Oh, if they but know," answered the devil. "A mouse is gnawing at the root. If they killed this, they would have golden apples again. But if it gnaws much longer, the tree will wither altogether. But leave me alone with your dreams. If you disturb me in my sleep again, you will get a box on the ear."
The grandmother spoke gently to him until he fell asleep again and snored. Then she took hold of the 3rd golden hair and pulled it out. The devil jumped up, roared out, and would have treated her ill if she had not quieted him once more and said,
"Who can help bad dreams?"
"What was the dream then?"
asked he, and was quite curious.
"I dreamt of a ferryman who complained that he must always ferry from one side to the other, and was never released. What is the cause of it?"
"Ha! The fool!" answered the devil. "When anyone comes and wants to go across, he must put the oar in his hand, and the other man will have to ferry, and he will be free."
As the grandmother had plucked out the 3 golden hairs, and the 3 questions were answered, she let the old serpent alone, and he slept until daybreak. When the devil had gone out again, the old woman took the ant out of the folds of her dress, and gave the luck child his human shape again.
"There are 3 golden hairs for you,"
said she.
"What the devil said to your 3 questions, I suppose you heard."
"Yes," answered he. "I heard and will take care to remember."
"You have what you want," said she, "and now you can go on your way."
He thanked the old woman for helping him in his need, and left hell well content that everything had turned out so fortunately. When he came to the ferryman, he was expected to give the promised answer. "Ferry me across first," said the luck child, "and then I will tell you how you can be set free." And when he reached the opposite shore, he gave him the devil's advice. "Next time anyone comes who wants to be ferried over, just put the oar in his hand." He went on and came to the town wherein stood the unfruitful tree, and there too the watchman wanted an answer. So he told him what he had heard from the devil. "Kill the mouse which is gnawing at its root, and it will again bear golden apples." The watchman thanked him, and gave him as a reward 2 asses laden with gold, which followed him. At last he came to the town whose well was dry. He told the watchman what the devil had said. "A toad is in the well beneath a stone. You must find it and kill it, and the well will again give wine in plenty." The watchman thanked him, and also gave him 2 asses laden with gold. At last the luck child got home to his wife, who was heartily glad to see him again, and to hear how well he had prospered in everything. To the king he took what he had asked for, the devil's 3 golden hairs, and when the king saw the 4 asses laden with gold, he was quite content, and said,
"Now, all the conditions are fulfilled, and you can keep my daughter. But tell me, dear son-in-law, where did all that gold come from? This is tremendous wealth."
"I was rowed across a river," answered he, "and I got it there. It lies on the shore instead of sand."
"Can I too fetch some of it?"
said the king, and he was quite eager about it. "As much as you like," answered he. "There is a ferryman on the river. Let him ferry you over, and you can fill your sacks on the other side." The greedy king set out in all haste, and when he came to the river, he beckoned to the ferryman to put him across. The ferryman came and bade him get in, and when they got to the other shore, he put the oar in his hand and sprang out. But from this time forth the king had to ferry as a punishment for his sins. Perhaps he is faring still. If he is, it is because no one has taken the oar from him. The Griffin. There was once upon a time a king, but where he reigned and what he was called, I do not know. He had no son, but an only daughter who had always been ill, and no doctor had been able to cure her. Then it was foretold to the king that his daughter should eat herself well with an apple. So he ordered it to be proclaimed throughout the whole of his kingdom, that whosoever brought his daughter an apple, with which she could eat herself well, should have her to wife and be king. This became known to a peasant who had 3 sons, and he said to the eldest, "Go out into the garden and take a basket of those beautiful apples with the red cheeks, and carry them to the court. Perhaps the king's daughter will be able to eat herself well with them, and then thou wilt marry her and be king." The lad did so and set out. When he had gone a short way, he met a little iron man who asked him what he had there in the basket, to which replied Wayla, for so was he named, "Frog's legs." On this, the little man said,
"Well, so shall it be and remain,"
and went away. At length, Wayla arrived at the palace and made it known that he had brought apples which could cure the king's daughter if she ate them. This delighted the king hugely, and he caused Wayla to be brought before him. But alas, when he opened the basket, instead of having apples in it, he had frog's legs, which were still kicking about. On this the king grew angry and had him driven out of the house. When he got home, he told his father how it had fared with him. Then the father sent the next son, who was called Seem, but all went with him just as it had gone with Wayla. He also met the little iron man, who asked what he had there in the basket. Seem said,
"Hog's bristle."
and the Iron Man said,
"Well, so shall it be and remain."
When Seem got to the king's palace and said he brought apples with which the king's daughter might eat herself well, they did not want to let him go in, and said that one fellow had already been there and had treated them as if they were fools. Seem, however, maintained that he certainly had the apples, and that they ought to let him go in. At length they believed him, and led him to the king, but when he uncovered the basket, he had but hog's bristle. This enraged the king most terribly, so he caused Seem to be whipped out of the house. When he got home, he related all that had befallen him. Then the youngest boy, whose name was Hans, but who was always called Stupid Hans, came and asked his father if he might go with some apples.
"Oh,"
said the father,
"thou wouldst be just the right fellow for such a thing. If the clever ones can't manage it, what canst thou do?"
The boy, however, did not believe him and said,
"Indeed, father, I wish to go." "Just get away, thou stupid fellow. Thou must wait till thou art wiser,"
said the father to that, and turned his back. Hans, however, pulled at the back of his smock frock and said,
"Indeed, father, I wish to go." "Well then, so far as I am concerned, thou mayst go. But thou wilt soon come home again,"
replied the old man in a spiteful voice. The boy, however, was tremendously delighted and jumped for joy.
"Well, act like a fool, thou growest more stupid every day,"
said the father again. Hans, however, did not care about that, and did not let it spoil his pleasure. But as it was then night, he thought he might as well wait until the morrow, for he could not get to court that day. All night long he could not sleep in his bed, and if he did doze for a moment, he dreamt of beautiful maidens, of palaces of gold and of silver and all kinds of things of that sort. Early in the morning he went forth on his way, and directly afterwards the little shabby-looking man in his iron clothes came to him, and asked what he was carrying in the basket. Hans gave him the answer that he was carrying apples with which the king's daughter was to eat herself well.
"Then,"
said the little man,
"so shall they be and remain."
But at the court they would none of them let Hans go in, for they said two had already been there who had told them that they were bringing apples, and one of them had frog's legs and the other hog's bristle. Hans, however, resolutely maintained that he most certainly had no frog legs, but some of the most beautiful apples in the whole kingdom. As he spoke so pleasantly, the doorkeeper thought he could not be telling a lie, and asked him to go in, and he was right, for when Hans uncovered his basket in the king's presence, golden yellow apples came tumbling out. The king was delighted, and caused some of them to be taken to his daughter, and then waited in anxious expectation until news should be brought to him of the effect they had. But before much time had passed by, news was brought to him. But who do you think it was who came? It was his daughter herself. As soon as she had eaten of those apples, she was cured, and sprang out of her bed. The joy the king felt cannot be described, but now he did not want to give his daughter in marriage to Hans, and said he must first make him a boat which would go quicker on dry land than on water. Hans agreed to the conditions, and went home, and related how it had fared with him. Then the father sent Wayla into the forest to make a boat of that kind. He worked diligently, and whistled all the time. At midday, when the sun was at the highest, came the little iron man and asked what he was making. Wayla gave him for answer,
"Wooden bowls for the kitchen."
The Iron Man said,
"So it shall be and remain."
By evening, Wayla thought he had now made the boat, but when he wanted to get into it, he had nothing but wooden bowls. The next day, Seem went into the forest, but everything went with him just as it had done with Wayla. On the third day, stupid Hans went. He worked away most industriously, so that the whole forest resounded with the heavy strokes, and all the while he sang and whistled right merrily. At midday, when it was the hottest, the little man came and asked what he was making.
"A boat which will go quicker on dry land than on the water," replied Hans. "And when I have finished it, I am to have the king's daughter for my wife."
"Well," said the little man, "such as one shall it be, and remain."
In the evening, when the sun had turned into gold, Hans finished his boat, and all that was wanted for it. He got into it and rowed to the palace. The boat went as swiftly as the wind. The king saw it from afar, but would not give his daughter to Hans yet, and said he must first yet take 100 hares out to pasture from early morning until late evening, and if one of them got away, he should not have his daughter. Hans was contented with this, and the next day went with his flock to the pasture, and took great care that none of them ran away. Before many hours had passed, came a servant from the palace, and told Hans that he must give her a hare instantly, for some visitors had come unexpectedly. Hans, however, was very well aware what that meant, and said he would not give her one. The king might set some hare soup before his guests next day. The maid, however, would not believe in his refusal, and at last she began to get angry with him. Then Hans said that if the king's daughter came herself, he would give her a hare. The maid told this in the palace, and the daughter did go herself. In the meantime, however, the little man came again to Hans and asked him what he was doing there. He said he had to watch over 100 hares and see that none of them ran away, and then he might marry the king's daughter and be king.
"Good," said the little man. "There is a whistle for thee, and if one of them runs away, just whistle with it, and then it will come back again."
When the king's daughter came, Hans gave her a hare into her apron, but when she had gone about 100 steps with it, he whistled, and the hare jumped out of the apron, and before she could turn around was back to the flock again. When the evening came, the hare herd whistled once more, and looked to see if all were there, and then drove them to the palace. The king wondered how Hans had been able to take 100 hares to graze without losing any of them. He would, however, not give him his daughter yet, and said he must now bring him a feather from the griffin's tail. Hans set out at once and walked straight forwards. In the evening he came to a castle, and there he had asked for a night's lodging, for at that time there were no inns. The lord of the castle promised him that with much pleasure, and asked where he was going. Hans answered,
"To the Griffin." "Oh, to the Griffin. They tell me he knows everything, and I have lost the key of an iron money chest, so you might be so good as to ask him where it is."
"Yes, indeed," said Hans. "I'll do that." Early the next morning he went onwards, and on his way arrived at another castle, in which he again stayed the night. When the people who lived there learnt that he was going to the Griffin, they said they had in the house a daughter who was ill, and that they had already tried every means to cure her, but none of them had done her any good, and he might be so kind as to ask the Griffin what would make their daughter healthy again. Hans said he would willingly do that, and went onwards. Then he came to a lake, and instead of a ferry boat, a tall man was there, who had to carry everybody across. The man asked Hans whither he was journeying.
"To the Griffin,"
said Hans.
"Then, when you get to him," said the man, "just ask him why I am forced to carry everybody over the lake."
"Yes, indeed. Most certainly I'll do that," said Hans. Then the man took him up on his shoulders and carried him across. At length, Hans arrived at the Griffin's house, but the wife only was at home and not the Griffin himself. Then the woman asked him what he wanted. Thereupon he told her everything, that he had to get a feather out of the Griffin's tail, and that there was a castle where they had lost the key of their money chest, and he was to ask the Griffin where it was, that in another castle the daughter was ill, and he was to learn what would cure her. And then not far from thence there was a lake and a man beside it, who was forced to carry people across it, and he was very anxious to learn why the man was obliged to do it. Then said the woman, "But look here, my good friend, no Christian can speak to the Griffin. He devours them all. But if you like, you can lie down under his bed, and in the night, when he is quite fast asleep, you can reach out and pull a feather out of his tail. And as for those things which you are to learn, I will ask about them myself." Hans was quite satisfied with this, and got under the bed. In the evening, the Griffin came home, and as soon as he entered the room said,
"Wife, I smell a Christian."
"Yes," said the woman. "One was here today, but he went away again." And on that, the Griffin said no more. In the middle of the night, when the Griffin was snoring loudly, Hans reached out and plucked a feather from his tail. The Griffin woke up instantly and said,
"Wife, I smell a Christian, and it seems to me that somebody was pulling at my tail."
His wife said, "Thou hast certainly been dreaming, and I told thee before that a Christian was here today, but that he went away again. He told me all kinds of things, that in one castle they had lost the key of their money chest, and could find it nowhere."
"Oh, the fools," said the Griffin. "The key lies in the wood house, under a log of wood behind the door."
And then he said that in another castle the daughter was ill, and they knew no remedy that would cure her.
"Oh, the fools," said the Griffin. "Under the cellar steps a toad has made its nest of her hair, and if she got her hair back, she would be well."
And then he also said that there was a place where there was a lake and a man beside it who was forced to carry everybody across.
"Oh, the fool," said the Griffin. "If he only put one man down in the middle, he would never have to carry another across."
Early the next morning, the Griffin got up and went out. Then Hans came forth from under the bed, and he had a beautiful feather, and had heard what the Griffin had said about the key and the daughter and the ferryman. The Griffin's wife repeated it all once more to him, that he might not forget it, and then he went home again. First he came to the man by the lake, who asked him what the Griffin had said, but Hans replied that he must first carry him across, and then he would tell him. So the man carried him across, and when he was over, Hans told him that all he had to do was to set one person down in the middle of the lake, and then he would never have to carry over any more. The man was hugely delighted, and told Hans that out of gratitude he would take him once more across and back again. But Hans said no, he would save him the trouble. He was quite satisfied already, and pursued his way. Then he came to the castle where the daughter was ill. He took her on his shoulders, for she could not walk, and carried her down the cellar steps, and pulled out the toad's nest from beneath the lower step and gave it into her hand. And she sprang off his shoulder and up the steps before him, and was quite cured. Then were the father and mother beyond measure rejoiced, and they gave Hans gifts of gold and of silver, and whatsoever else he wished for, that they gave him. And when he got to the other castle, he went at once into the wood house, and found the key under the log of wood behind the door, and took it to the lord of the castle. He also was not a little pleased, and gave Hans as a reward much of the gold that was in the chest, and all kinds of things besides, such as cows and sheep and goats. When Hans arrived before the king with all these things, with the money and the gold and the silver and cows, sheep and goats, the king asked him how he had come by them. Then Hans told him that the Griffin gave everyone whatsoever he wanted. So the king thought he himself could make such things useful, and set out on his way to the Griffin. But when he got to the lake, it happened that he was the very first who arrived there after Hans, and the man put him down in the middle of it and went away, and the king was drowned. Hans, however, married the daughter and became king. The Sea-hare. There was once upon a time a princess who, high under the battlements in her castle, had an apartment with 12 windows which looked out in every possible direction. And when she climbed up to it and looked around her, she could inspect her whole kingdom. When she looked out of the first, her sight was more keen than that of any other human being. From the second, she could see still better. From the third, more distinctly still. And so it went on, until the 12th, from which she saw everything above the earth and under the earth, and nothing at all could be kept secret from her. Moreover, as she was haughty, and would be subject to no one, but wished to keep the dominion for herself alone, she caused it to be proclaimed that no one should ever be her husband, who could not conceal himself from her so effectually, and it should be quite impossible for her to find him. He who tried this, however, and was discovered by her, was to have his head struck off and stuck on a post. 97 posts with the heads of dead men were already standing before the castle, and no one had came forward for a long time. The princess was delighted and thought to herself, "Now I shall be free as long as I live." Then 3 brothers appeared before her and announced to her that they were desirous of trying their luck. The eldest believed he would be quite safe if he crept into a lime pit, but she saw him from the first window, made him come out, and had his head cut off. The second crept into the cellar of the palace, but she perceived him also from the first window, and his fate was sealed. His head was placed on the 99th post. Then the youngest came to her and entreated her to give him a day for consideration, and also to be so gracious as to look over it if she should happen to discover him twice. But if he failed the 3rd time, he would look on his life as over. As he was so handsome and begged so earnestly, she said, "Yes, I will grant thee that, but thou wilt not succeed." The next day, he meditated for a long time how he should hide himself, but all in vain. Then he seized his gun and went out hunting. He saw a raven, took a good aim at him, and was just going to fire when the bird cried, "Don't shoot! I will make it worthy thy while not." He put his gun down, went on, and came to a lake where he surprised a large fish which had come up from the depths below to the surface of the water. When he had aimed at it, the fish cried, "Don't shoot, and I will make it worth thy while." He allowed it to dive down again, went onwards, and met a fox which was lame. He fired and missed it, and the fox cried,
"You had much better come here and draw the thorn out of my foot for me."
He did this, but then he wanted to kill the fox and skin it. The fox said,
"Stop, and I will make it worth thy while."
The youth let him go, and then as it was evening, returned home. The next day, he was to hide himself, but howsoever much he puzzled his brains over it, he did not know where. He went into the forest to the raven and said, "I let thee live on, so now tell me where I am to hide myself so that the king's daughter shall not see me." The raven hung his head and thought it over for a long time. At length, he croaked, "I have it." He fetched an egg out of his nest, cut it into 2 parts, and shut the youth inside it, then made it whole again and seated himself on it. When the king's daughter went to the first window, she could not discover him, nor could she see from the others, and she began to be uneasy. But from the 11th she saw him. She ordered the raven to be shot, and the egg to be brought and broken, and the youth was forced to come out. She said, "For once thou art excused, but if thou dost not do better than this, thou art lost." Next day, he went to the lake and called the fish to him and said, "I suffered thee to live. Now tell me where to hide myself so that the king's daughter may not see me." The fish thought for a while, and at last cried,
"I have it. I will shut thee up in my stomach."
He swallowed him and went down to the bottom of the lake. The king's daughter looked through her windows, and even from the 11th did not see him, and was alarmed. But at length from the 12th she saw him. She ordered the fish to be caught and killed. Then the youth appeared. Everyone can imagine what a state of mind he was in. She said, "Twice thou art forgiven, but be sure that thy head will be set on the 100th post." On the last day, he went with a heavy heart into the country and met the fox. "Thou knowest how to find all kinds of hiding places," said he. "I let thee live. Now advise me where I shall hide myself so that the king's daughter shall not discover me."
"That's a hard task,"
answered the fox, looking very thoughtful. At length he cried,
"I have it,"
and went with him to a spring, dipped himself in it, and came out as a stall keeper in the market, and dealer in animals. The youth had to dip himself in the water also, and was changed into a small sea-hare. The merchant went into the town and showed the pretty little animal, and many persons gathered together to see it. At length the king's daughter came likewise, and as she liked it very much, she bought it, and gave the merchant a good deal of money for it. Before he gave it over to her, he said to it,
"With the king's daughter goes to the window, creep quickly under the braids of her hair."
And now the time arrived when she was to search for him. She went to the window after another in turn, from the 1st to the 11th, and did not see him. When she did not see him from the 12th either, she was full of anxiety and anger, and shut it down with such violence that the glass in every window shivered into 1,000 pieces, and the whole castle shook. She went back and felt the sea-hare beneath the braids of her hair. Then she seized it and threw it on the ground, exclaiming, "Away with thee! Get out of my sight!" It ran to the merchant, and both of them hurried to the spring, wherein they plunged and received back their true forms. The youth thanked the fox and said, "The raven and the fish are idiots compared with thee. Thou knowest the right tune to play. There is no denying that." The youth went straight to the palace. The princess was already expecting him, and accommodated herself to her destiny. The wedding was solemnized, and now he was king and lord of all the kingdom. He never told her where he had concealed himself for the 3rd time, and who had helped him, so she believed that he had done everything by his own skill, and she had a great respect for him, for she thought to herself, "He is able to do more than I." The Girl Without Hands. A certain miller had little by little fallen into poverty, and had nothing left but his mill and a large apple tree behind it. Once he had gone into the forest to fetch wood. An old man stepped up to him, who he had never seen before, and said,
"Why dost thou plague thyself with cutting wood? I will teach thee rich, if thou wilt promise me what is standing behind thy mill."
"What
What can that be but my apple tree? Thought the miller, and said, Yes,
and gave a written promise to the stranger. He, however, laughed mockingly and said, When 3 years have passed, I will come and carry away what belongs to me. And then he went. When the miller got home, his wife came to meet him and said, Tell me, miller, from whence comes this sudden wealth into our house? All at once every box and chest was filled. No one brought it in, and I know how it happened. He answered,
It comes from a stranger who met me in the forest, and promised me great treasure. I, in return, have promised him what stands behind the mill. We can very well give him the big apple tree for it.
Ah, husband, said the terrified wife, that must have been the devil. He did not mean the apple tree, but our daughter, who was standing behind the mill sweeping the yard. The miller's daughter was a beautiful, pious girl, and lived through the 3 years in the fear of God and without sin. When therefore the time was over, and the day came when the evil one was to fetch her, she washed herself clean and made a circle round herself with chalk. The devil appeared quite early, but he could not come near to her. Angrily he said to the miller,
Take all water away from her, that she may no longer be able to wash herself, for otherwise I have no power over her.
The miller was afraid and did so. The next morning the devil came again, but she had wept on her hands, and they were quite clean. Again he could not get near her, and furiously said to the miller,
Cut her hands off, or else I cannot get the better of her.
The miller was shocked and answered,
How could I cut my own child's hands?
Then the evil one threatened him and said,
If thou dost not do it, thou art mine, and I will take thee myself.
The daughter became alarmed and promised to obey him. So he went to the girl and said,
My child, if I do not cut off both thine hands, the devil will carry me away, and in my terror I have promised to do it. Help me in my need, and forgive me the harm I do thee.
She replied,
Dear father, do with me what you will. I am your child.
Thereupon she laid down both her hands and let them be cut off. The devil came for the 3rd time, but she had wept so long and so much on the stumps that after all they were quite clean. Then he had to give in and had lost all right over her. The miller said to her,
I have by means of thee received such great wealth that I will keep thee most delicately as long as thou livest.
But she replied,
Here I cannot stay. I will go forth. Compassionate people will give me as much as I require.
Thereupon she caused her maimed arms to be bound to her back, and by sunrise she set out on her way, and walked the whole day until night fell. Then she came to a royal garden, and by the shimmering of the moon she saw that trees covered with beautiful fruits grew in it, but she could not enter, for there was much water round about it. And as she had walked the whole day, and not eaten one mouthful, and hunger tormented her, she thought,
Ah, if I were but inside, that I might eat of the fruit, else must I die of hunger.
Then she knelt down, called on God the Lord, and prayed, and suddenly an angel came towards her, who made a dam in the water, so that the moat became dry and she could walk through it. And now she went into the garden, and the angel went with her. She saw a tree covered with beautiful pears, but they were all counted. Then she went to them, and to still her hunger, ate one with her mouth from the tree, but no more. The gardener was watching, but as the angel was standing by, he was afraid and thought the maiden was a spirit, and was silent, neither did he dare to cry out or to speak to the spirit. When she had eaten the pear, she was satisfied and went and concealed herself among the bushes. The king to whom the garden belonged came down to it next morning and counted, and saw that one of the pears was missing, and asked the gardener what had become of it, and it was not lying beneath the tree, but was gone. Then answered the gardener, "Last night a spirit came in, who had no hands, and ate off one of the pears with its mouth." The king said,
"How did the spirit get over the water, and where did it go after it had eaten the pear?"
The gardener answered, "Someone came in a snow-white garment from heaven who made a dam, and kept back the water, that the spirit might walk through the moat. And as it must have been an angel, I was afraid and asked no questions, and did not cry out. When the spirit had eaten the pear, it went back again." The king said,
"If it be as thou sayest, I will watch with thee tonight."
When it grew dark, the king came into the garden and brought a priest with him, who was to speak to the spirit. All three seated themselves beneath the tree and watched. At midnight, the maiden came creeping out of the thicket, went to the tree, and again ate one pear off it with her mouth. And beside her stood the angel in white garments. Then the priest went out to them and said, "Comest thou from heaven or from earth? Art thou a spirit or a human being?" She replied,
"I am no spirit, but an unhappy mortal deserted by all but God."
The king said,
"If thou art forsaken by all the world, yet will I not forsake thee."
He took her with him into his royal palace, and as she was so beautiful and good, he loved her with all his heart, had silver hands made for her, and took her to wife. After a year, the king had to take the field, so he commended his young queen to the care of his mother and said,
"If she is brought to bed, take care of her, nurse her well, and tell me of it at once in a letter."
Then she gave birth to a fine boy, so the old mother made haste to write and announce the joyful news to him. But the messenger rested by a brook on the way, and as he was fatigued by the great distance, he fell asleep. Then came the devil, who was always seeking to injure the good queen, and exchanged a letter for another, in which was written that the queen had brought a monster into the world. When the king read the letter, he was shocked and much troubled. But he wrote in answer that they were to take great care of the queen and nurse her well until his arrival. The messenger went back with the letter, but rested at the same place and again fell asleep. Then came the devil once more, and put a different letter in his pocket, in which it was written that they were to put the queen and her child to death. The old mother was terribly shocked when she received the letter, and could not believe it. She wrote back again to the king, but received no other answer, because each time the devil substituted a false letter. And in the last letter it was also written that she was to preserve the queen's tongue and eyes as a token that she had obeyed. But the old mother wept to think such innocent blood was to be shed, and had a hind brought by night and cut out her tongue and eyes, and kept them. Then said she to the queen,
"I cannot have thee killed as the king commands, but there thou mayest stay no longer. Go forth into the wide world with thy child, and never come here again."
The poor woman tied her child on her back, and went away with eyes full of tears. She came into a great wild forest, and then she fell on her knees and prayed to God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to her, and led her to a little house on which was a sign with the words, "Here all dwell free." A snow-white maiden came out of the little house and said,
"Welcome, Lady Queen,"
and conducted her inside. Then they unbound the little boy from her back, and held him to her breast that he might feed, and laid him in a beautifully made little bed. Then said the poor woman,
"From whence knowest thou that I was a queen?"
The white maiden answered,
"I am an angel sent by God to watch over thee and thy child."
The queen stayed 7 years in the little house and was well cared for, and by God's grace, because of her piety, her hands which had been cut off grew once more. At last the king came home again from the war, and his first wish was to see his wife and the child. Then his aged mother began to weep and said,
"Thou wicked man, why didst thou write to me that I was to take those 2 innocent lives?"
And she showed him the 2 letters which the evil one had forged, and then continued,
"I did as thou badest me."
And she showed the tokens, the tongue and eyes. Then the king began to weep for his poor wife and his little son so much more bitterly than she was doing, that the aged mother had compassion on him and said,
"Be at peace, she still lives. I secretly caused a hind to be killed, and took these tokens from him. But I bound the child to thy wife's back, and bade her go forth into the wide world, and made her promise never to come back here again, because thou wert so angry with her."
Then spake the king,
"I will go as far as the sky is blue, and will neither eat nor drink until I have found again my dear wife and my child, if in the meantime they have not been killed or died of hunger."
Thereupon the king traveled about for 7 long years, and sought her in every cleft of the rocks, and in every cave, but he found her not, and thought she had died of want. During the whole of this time he neither ate nor drank, but God supported him. At length he came into a great forest, and found therein the little house whose sign was, "Here all dwell free." Then forth came the white maiden, took him by the hand, led him in, and said,
"Welcome, Lord King,"
and asked him from whence he came. He answered,
"Soon shall I have traveled about for the space of 7 years, and I seek my wife and her child, but cannot find them."
The angel offered him meat and drink, but he did not take anything, and only wished to rest a little. Then he lay down to sleep, and put a handkerchief over his face. Thereupon the angel went into the chamber where the queen sat with her son, whom she usually called Sorrowful, and said to her,
"Go out with thy child, thy husband hath come."
So she went to the place where he lay, and the handkerchief fell from his face. Then said she,
"Sorrowful, pick up thy father's handkerchief, and cover his face again."
The child picked it up, and put it over his face again. The king in his sleep heard what passed, and had pleasure in letting the handkerchief fall once more. But the child grew impatient, and said,
"Dear mother, how can I cover my father's face when I have no father in this world? I have learnt to say the prayer, 'Our Father, which art in heaven.' Thou hast told me that my father was in heaven, and was the good God, and how can I know a wild man like this? He is not my father."
When the king heard that, he got up, and asked who they were. Then she said,
"I am thy wife, and that is thy son, Sorrowful."
And he saw her living hands, and said,
"My wife had silver hands."
She answered,
"The good God has caused my natural hands to grow again."
And the angel went into the inner room, and brought the silver hands and showed them to him. Hereupon he knew for a certainty that it was his dear wife, and his dear child, and he kissed them, and was glad, and said,
"A heavy stone has fallen off my heart."
Then the angel of God gave them 1 meal with her, and after that they went home to the king's aged mother. There were great rejoicings everywhere, and the king and queen were married again, and lived contentedly to their happy end.